Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Thunder Drone. On and on and on and on. Tonight, in the red corner, weighing billions of dollars in lobbyist donations, influence and unelected power, Australia's newly announced climate change sort of policy, the technology solution. And in the blue corner, weighing in at a metric 62% of the Australian population and fresh from his tour of New Zealand, the zero net carbon emission solution.
Yes, Johnny, Australia has never been so excited to watch two fighters with absolutely no muscle mass, or flesh for that matter, go at each other like Bundaberg rum in a glass of milk. And don't forget to start tracking these two figures' stats, which, well, I'm sure they'll be somewhere. Oh, this is very unprofessional. Can somebody get me those details of those fighters, please? Anyway, let the clanking of bare bones begin.
Hello, and welcome to episode 12 of The Pouch, the podcast recently voted most attractive podcast in the Southern Hemisphere that aims to help the average Aussie try and make sense of their current political environment. I'm Greg. Pretty sure Jake is underpaying me for this podcast, savage.
And I'm Jake. Damn, Greg, I thought Woolworths said they were going to pay you Far Wharton. On this week's episode, we talk journalism, industry, and backseat drivers. And we also explore the dual-citizenship drama.
Well, Jake, I wish
Greg.
I could say it's been speak to me in that tone. I sort of thought this week would be a bit of a quiet week, and I try and look for themes every week in politics and what's happening,
Yes.
and I try and make it a little bit different than climate change, but it seems like that's sort of that's the permeating theme over the last few weeks, and it seems to have continued this week. Yep. I know that both Liberal and Labor have sort of brought out the big guns. They've wheeled out the cannons, and they're showing everyone off their shiny new policies. Tell us about what's happening.
Well, on one side of politics, the Prime Minister of the country, Scott Morrison, just in case you weren't paying attention, or you were worried that it had changed hands overnight, he has said that he will be launching a policy around technology. It is technology that is going to save our futures, not taxation. Well, there you go. Technology, not taxation. I like that. That's a very easy marketing line there.
It is a very easy marketing line, and you know what? I'm going to say this, and I know that I'm going to ruffle some feathers, and that's okay. I kind of like his line on this one in that, Australia's not going to, if we get to this zero net emissions, which Labor's talking about, and we'll talk about that as well. But
we will.
If we get to that won't make too big of an impact, right? We need China, we need India, we need these bigger polluters to be doing their bit. If they're not going to come to the party, well, then technology is really the only thing that's sort of going to save us. So I kind of see where he's coming from. Like I've said before, I try and spend some time in that space to try and see where they're coming from. And I kind of dig it. What do you think?
I'm certainly not opposed to the premise of, innovating with technology to improve energy efficiency, to decrease emissions, and to, in the future, smooth the way that energy is produced with, by diversifying the types of energy that we are producing things from. So wind, solar, nuclear, even, water production. There's geothermal. There's heaps of these different things that are, going largely untapped at the moment in favor of coal. So I am definitely in favor of improving our efficiency, et cetera, through technology. I would also say, though, that I am always a little bit irked when the Prime Minister and several of his colleagues talk about the fact that taxation taxation does not work, because the evidence suggests that following the implementation of the, what was essentially crudely called the carbon tax that was, implemented by the Julia Gillard Labor government, and was going to become an emissions trading scheme after 2 years in action, but it was unceremoniously kicked out by then Prime Minister Tony Abbott. That scheme absolutely worked. It took a little bit of time, but you would expect it to take that little bit of time because it forced industry to change their ways. It essentially said, hey, industry, bros, okay, and ladies, of course, we are going to we're going to get you to pay more if you don't, correct your ways in the amount of carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, methane, etc., that you're producing and eking out into the atmosphere. And it worked. It absolutely reduced the amount by, and I don't have the figures in front of me, but it absolutely did reduce the amount of carbon pollution in our atmosphere that is produced by Australian industry. So, that is to say, absolutely not at all against the premise of technology. I've often, been the big champion of technology who says, it is absolutely our future. And I'm absolutely down for having my brain removed from my biological body and inserted into a carbon nanofiber or metallic frame in the future. But that's in the future.
Well, look, I think on the Party Room this week, the ABC podcast, they had an interview with someone, and I'm trying to find out who it is, but I can't pick it up at the moment. And he was saying that this whole situation is a bit like a Rorschach test, and I guess I guess that's where we're at, right? Because there wasn't a lot of details in this whole technology situation. But then Labor's come out with their shiny new weapon as well, and they're showing that off, and they're saying, well, check out this bad boy. We're going zero net carbon emissions by 2050, is it?
It is, absolutely, by 2050. And this is, it's good. It even improves on the previous Labor policy that was brought to the last election by Bill Shorten of a 45% reduction by 2030. In that, it extends the time and increases the percentage of emissions reduced. So it's fantastic, and it is. I suppose the other thing that the Labor leader Anthony Albanese did was he said essentially we're setting a real target, and we're going to achieve this target with none of those so-called carryover credits that the Prime Minister has, quote, cooked up to give the impression that he's doing something when he isn't, end quote.
All right, well, we'll have to see how that one plays out. It'll be interesting to see how, the lobbyists take this one, how the Murdoch press take this one, how, if everyone's kind of happy with the direction that ScoMo's taking. And by everyone, I mean, the lobbyists and the Murdoch press, and how the left feel about Anthony Albanese's claim as well, because apparently there's not a great deal of costings that have been released either. So
I suppose just on that, it's not... I suppose it's not unreasonable to expect that the party that isn't in power, wouldn't necessarily have a fully costed policy ready to go essentially 2 and a bit years before an election. So that's not necessarily bad at all. If anything, it's good because it is essentially saying, hey, we are your alternative government, and if an election were held today, this is what we would take to it, and in the process of doing that, we would fully cost it. So that's not bad, on the face of it.
Yeah.
But the other side of that is,
well, it's also not bad from a political perspective, because you got 62% of people, apparently, according to a couple of polls, 62% of Australians are all like, yeah, let's do this zero net carbon emissions business.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is something...
I think the other 38% are minors.
So the other interesting thing here is, of course, that the whole premise of technology, not taxation, TM, is... that's not being costed either. And there's really no substance in that beyond the premise that, hey, we're going to either as a government invest in industry to do better, or we're going to create there's not a lot of substance behind that policy.
Okay, well, we'll see how it plays out, and and speaking of Julian Assange. He's
Masterful segue.
It's all I got. Speaking of men trapped by their own delusions, Julian Assange is back in the media. I remember sitting on the couch when I used to live in Brisbane, Jake, when we were running the iFriends podcast, which is still going to this day. Check it out. And I remember sitting on the couch going, this is big news. Like this whole Julian Assange thing, this is like the realest news I've had since 9/11. And of course, it sort of just, floundered around. And then he was in which embassy was he in? The Ecuadorian embassy, was it, for a few years? And he comes out looking like Gollum / any other character from Lord of the Rings, all sort of mushed into one.
Yep.
And now he's back in the news. What's he doing? What's happening?
Yeah, so we've got two politicians from Australia, George Christensen and the independent MP Andrew Wilkie, who have visited Julian Assange this week in prison in the lead up to this extradition hearing. And they've referred to him collectively as, quote, a man under enormous pressure and whose general health and mental health have deteriorated considerably. Both of them are...
Well, that's understandable.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, he was charged with a bunch of stuff. He went out on bail and then he was cooped up in the Ecuadorian embassy, essentially living in a bathroom, what is ostensibly a bathroom, for, almost a decade. And then, he's back in essentially in jail awaiting hearing to be extradited to the US, where he could be held on these charges of...
Espionage. Yeah,
but the major concern here, and the reason why these two politicians from Australia have gone over there and essentially said enough is enough, you need to leave this guy alone and let him come home. The major concern here is that it sets a very troubling precedent of essentially a journalist releases some information that is contrary to the thoughts or the will of another nation, another powerful nation, and that powerful nation, it seems, has the right to extradite them to their own country to try that person in a court of their own land rather than one of their home country. So it is quite a scary thing.
See, who would have thought he'd be itching to get back to that Ecuadorian bathroom? Hey?
Exactly.
And I'm sure there's some people who have an apartment here in Sydney who'd like a word. And I like what you've got here in the script here about Christensen and what he said. He said, I'm a big fan of Trump. I'm a big fan of Bojo, which is Boris Johnson, and I didn't know that Bojo was a thing.
Well, it is now, at least.
Bojo.
He does kind of look like a Bojo, though.
Yeah. I wonder if that Jojo Bo thing, like maybe he's going to bring out a Bojo Bo.
I don't know what
maybe a Bojo Bo tie.
I don't know what Jojo Bo is, but
that's all right. Someone out there will, depending on our demographic.
What's Jojo Bo?
I don't want to go down that part. You can Google that later.
Okay, all right.
But I would put I wouldn't let Google know that you're Googling it.
Okay, fair enough.
You're going to just be swamped with Jojo for the rest of your life.
Oh,
anyway. Now, Jake, my very first car was a Holden, and I wish I could tell you that I was very much attached to that car because it was a Holden, but I'm not, and I wasn't. And, but I did like it. It was a Holden Commodore station wagon. It was bulky. It was big. I was a muso at the time. I carried around my drums in it. It served me very, very well until one day on my birthday where I was driving home and it was very, very wet. And I came up over a crescent. A line of cars were backed up from a roundabout. Taxi right there. Went up the backside of the taxi and farewell Holden Commodore station wagon. Someone bought it from the side of the road from me for like $200 or something.
Wow.
Fond memories.
Yeah.
They're my fond memories of Holdens. And that's it. That's it. We can put the full stop on that now. They're all done. They're all done. What happened and why are we talking about this on a political podcast, Jake?
Yeah, well, first up, the reason that we're talking about it this week is that it was announced this week that after 160 years, the Holden era is over because General Motors, the parent company of Holden, have announced that it will dump the iconic Australian car brand from the end of this year. And what that means is that some 600 Holden employees are likely to lose their jobs, and it all follows GM's decision to close up the company's local manufacturing operations from 2017. But why are we talking about it here? As you say, the reason for it is we've paid about $2 billion in subsidies to keep Holden in Australia. First of all, to establish Holden, but then to keep it in the country, manufacturing cars, over the last several decades, and it is really unfortunate that it is invariably quite a iconic Australian brand, as is, Ford and Bond's underwear and various other things. Dunlop volleys.
Vegemite.
Yeah, no, not really. Yeah. I don't think so. But you're absolutely right. All these things, they are iconically Australian. And it is unfortunate that after such an enormous amount of money in subsidies, and subsidies are there in order to both stimulate stimulate the economy, by way of enabling local manufacturing that will enable people to be hired, and they make money and they spend in the local economy, etc. But also just simply to keep manufacturing in Australia. That those two ideas were incredibly important for the longest time, particularly while Australia was or had a thriving manufacturing sector. But the announcement comes really only 6 years after the former Treasurer Joe Hockey was accused of chasing the manufacturers out of the country after he urged the company to, quote, put up or pack up and come clean about whether it planned to shut up the local operations in Australia. And Scott Morrison, quite rightly, I think, because of that whole premise of the $2 billion in subsidies, was incredibly angry in a press conference earlier this week. He said that he was very upset and angry that the iconic Holden brand was allowed to, quote, wither and die after demanding billions of dollars in taxpayer subsidies to remain in Australia.
It's one of those phenomenons, isn't it? Where, I remember where the banks were going under, and we all pitched in and helped them out a little bit, and it's just a bit odd, isn't it, when you start pitching? I mean, if I run a business and it goes under, that's it. I'm done. Whereas if you're nice and big and powerful, you can sort of get these subsidies from the government, and gosh, it must be handy. But at the same time, it's a tricky one to tread, because you can't keep going, well, we've kind of got to get rid of the surplus now, thanks coronavirus and bushfires. To the bushfires.
No, it's an interesting move. It's an understandable move, of course, because Australia really doesn't have the vibrant manufacturing sector that it once did. But, there's a little bit of irony to that, because essentially one of the great very large manufacturers within Australia was Holden for the longest time, essentially producing their cars, which were invariably then Australian made, Australian built, etc., and then sold in Australia to Australians who drove them and then, parked them on the side of a road and handed them over for $200 and then went out and bought another Holden or whatever. The idea of having sorry for paraphrasing your brilliant story at the beginning, but it is one of those things that it was a stalwart of Australian manufacturing for the longest time, and it's not uncommon. These car manufacturers, they drive into town, pun intended, and they essentially
they don't have a car yet. They haven't started yet. Anyway,
that's true. They walk into town, and they ask the local governments to essentially fund the construction of factories on the promise that they will hire workers for those factories once they're built. But essentially,
and the government, I imagine, would make that money back through tax.
That is absolutely the intention, but invariably they also end up giving out tax concessions as well. The way that they make it back is essentially through their workers. The workers that get hired, that earn salaries, and then they pay income tax, they pay GST, et cetera.
Yeah. Jake, we often ponder after a show. We spend a little bit of time reflecting, don't we? We often turn the pouch into the couch, reflect on what the episode meant to us, and we sometimes feel like we're leaving out the people on the other side of Australia over there in Western Australia. So we've tried to dig up a little bit of a story for them, and we might do this once a week for a little while. We'll try and see what's happening in the world of Western Australia. We tried to do this last week, Jake, with a woman who was getting asked to remove her dogs because they were
pooping too much.
They were pooping too much, and we thought that might not be pouch worthy. But you managed to dig up something this week, which is potentially pouch worthy. Tell us about what's happening in the Western Australian in an RSL. What's happening over there?
I will do, but I will also say that there's nothing worse than poop in your pouch. So I'm glad that we did avoid that.
No.
But look,
we haven't actually tackled the topic of how you and I go to the bathroom here in the pouch, have we?
No, but it's
we'll
okay to leave
behind the scenes.
It's okay to leave some things to mythology.
Yeah. Okay. If you've got your ideas, send us a message on Facebook or
send a letter
send
to
us a tweet.
Exactly. So look, this is an very unfortunate news story, particularly coming a week after the Closing the Gap announcements and stock take on how we're going. The Western Australian branch of the Return Services Leavers Club, or RSLs, has banned the performance of the, quote, Welcome to Country ceremonies and the flying of the Aboriginal flag at all of its Anzac and Remembrance Day services in the future. The Veterans Organisation said that it did not support the performance of Ode of Remembrance in an Aboriginal language last year, ceremonies which commemorated those who died during various wars. Now, the new policy...
What was their reason for this, I suppose?
It's very difficult to comprehend their reason, mainly because they didn't give one. So it leaves a lot to speculate. Essentially, they just said when that person spoke the ode to remembrance in a local Indigenous language, we didn't support it, we didn't like it. Therefore, no more of that, and you can't fly your flag over here anymore, which is really unfortunate. Again, so close after last week's check-in on and announcement that we've been failing so poorly in terms of closing the gap. Now, the policy says that, quote, whilst we have the utmost respect for the traditional owners of the land upon which such sites and memorials are located, RSL WA does not view it appropriate that a welcome to country is used at sites that were specifically established to pay homage to those who died and who came from a wide range of cultural backgrounds.
That's interesting. Yeah, look, one of the things, so this is not one specific RSL. This is like every RSL in Western Australia.
Well, it's this association that oversees the RSL Western Australia. Essentially, and while it said in the announcement that it has no power to enforce these laws, it said it can disendorse some ceremonies if they do disobey this new policy. Now, I thought we might provide a bit of a counterpoint to this because there's a couple of associations and ministers have spoken out about this. Gary Oakley, the president of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Veterans and Services Associations of Australia, said, quote, as an Indigenous person, I think it's a bit of a slap in the face to us because this is our country too. And so Western Australia Veterans Affairs Minister Peter Tinley called it a, quote, wrong decision and said he was, quote, deeply disappointed. Quote, I think it is out of step with the general community approach and the long, hard road to reconciliation across this country.
Jake, this week, while we are snug as a bug, as a rug in this proverbial pouch, and, I haven't needed to go to the bathroom yet, which is very, very lucky, I want to know this week about the dual citizenship saga. How did it start? How did we end up losing so many politicians? And what are the implications today? I think I read about Josh Frydenberg. So it's sort of still creeping up. It's a bit like the pork barreling. It'll just never quite go away, will it? Despite how much cream you put on it, it's just going to persist. That's what happens when you buy the no-name brand.
Yeah, exactly. If symptoms persist, please see a doctor. Well, yeah, look, it's why don't we revisit sort of why this is quite important and, why we did, in fact, lose quite a bit of the parliament in the last couple of years over this saga. So Section 44I or 1 of the Constitution says, quote, any person may be a candidate for federal parliament as long as they are not under any acknowledgement of allegiance, obedience or adherence to a foreign power, or is a subject or a citizen or entitled to the rights or privileges of a subject or citizen of a foreign power. Anyway, that was a long-winded way of saying...
hang on. I want to know if this counts, if this, this whole Jedi as a religion thing. I mean, they have an allegiance to a foreign power, wouldn't they?
No. It's not a religion thing at all. It's entirely a country-based thing. It's entirely a...
All right, forget I said
No, I'm going to remember it forever.
Just forget about it. No,
okay.
Forget about it. It's not like it was recorded or anything. Go.
No, it is entirely based on, and I suppose to paraphrase or to slightly cut away at all of that legalese in there, essentially it's saying if you hold citizenship or you could have been thought to have held citizenship with another country and you have not made any substantial effort to distance yourself or remove yourself from the citizenship of that other country, then you are ineligible to run for parliament. That's the long and short. The very long and hopefully a little bit of the short of it as well. So a little bit of the history and how this has been enacted. So starting back in July of 2017, the eligibility of several members of Parliament of Australia to be elected was questioned, and it was referred to by some, and in fact probably also me, as a constitutional crisis, mainly because I like alliteration, even though it was only 2 words. But yeah.
That's fair. Still
total,
counts.
15 sitting politicians were ruled to be ineligible even by the High Court of Australia, or they resigned preemptively of in knowledge of their dual citizenship. It was so in 2017, 6 senators, and at the time the Deputy Prime Minister Barnaby Joyce. They were known as the citizenship. I can't even say that. I'm just going to skip that whole sentence.
The citizenship
7.
Yeah. I can't say it.
But I also removed.
Well, no wonder it didn't take off. It's the COVID-19 of 2017.
Exactly. But in 2017, the High Court unanimously determined that many of the people who had been referred to the High Court for their citizenship issue for the citizenship constitutional crisis, there we go, there's another C to add to it, had been ineligible to be elected as dual citizens at the time of nomination, and that included the former Deputy Prime Minister Barnaby Joyce. Now, interestingly enough, Greg, Michael McCormack became leader shortly after Joyce was re-elected in the by-election after that High Court ruling, because he was hiding the fact that he was having an affair with his media advisor and was due to have a child with her fairly soon after. So yes, in total 15 members of Parliament and senators were removed or preemptively left their roles, and several of them regained their position after renouncing their extra citizenships. But back to Frydenberg now. The senior Liberal MP's lawyer earlier this week told 3 federal court judges hearing the petition that while there was, quote, no single piece of paper to prove his family's renunciation of Hungarian citizenship from his mother, who fled Hungary in 1949 due to the rise of communism and indeed persecution of Jews, and his mother was Jewish. He said that the lawyer said that his family believed that it had separated formally from Hungary and described themselves as, quote, stateless on arrival in Australia. But the hearing and deliberation will continue on that case.
All right. Well, so we don't know yet. Is he going to be okay?
Look, politicians often refer to this thing known as the pub test, which is if you were to ask the general everyday citizen in a pub what they thought of a particular issue, how would they react? You know, would they think it just sounds like a ridiculous farce, or is it the sort of thing that sounds appropriate? In this case, I think the premise that he is a dual citizen of Hungary and Australia due to his mother's descent, I think that does not pass the pub test. I think that it is fair to state that because his mother, as a child at the time, escaped Hungary, fleeing as a Jewish person to Australia due to the rise of communism and persecution of the Jewish people at that time, came to Australia, that they were felt as stateless at the time. I think it is fair to say that he is not a dual citizen of Hungary and Australia. I think that is the passing of the pub test.
I'm all for all decisions, legal decisions being made that way from now on, Jake. And if you're not happy to settle on that, I'm happy to do the research. I'm happy to go to pubs and find out, firsthand what people really think. Like, let's put this pub test theory to the test.
Yeah, that's actually a really good idea, Greg. Legitimately, that is a fantastic idea.
The boys from Politics Over Coffee, they did an episode from a pub. I reckon we could do the same. Speaking of being off to the pub, Jake, thank you so much for chatting to me today. But before we go, what would you like our listeners to do?
Well, thanks, Greg. I would very much like our listeners to hit the subscribe button and follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook by searching for The Pouch, the podcast.
Yes, and I would further like you to go and give us a 5-star rating on the podcast player that you're on at the moment, and even write a review. We haven't got a review written yet, so be the first, and we'll mention you next week on next week's show, as long as it's a good one. Stuff it. We'll do it if it's a bad one as well. We'll give you a crack. Why not? And if you want to share the love, you can tell your friends to head to thepouchthepodcast.com, where they can choose their favorite podcast player and subscribe that way. Jake, I will speak to you next week.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you, listeners. Is it all right that I kept going? Or do
That's
you want me to
fine
go
that
back
you kept going, Jake.
The end of the last one?
No. I want you to keep going.
Okay. No, but I can go back to where we stopped.
No. God, don't get back, Jake.
Right.
Just keep going. Right. Yeah.